Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Merced Counts 2020. My name is John Bard. I'm the Associate Director of the Political Voice Program at Advancement Project California, and I'm joined by my colleague, Alejandra Ponce de Leon, who is a Policy and Research Analyst for Political Voice. For those unfamiliar with our organization, Advancement Project California is a multiracial civil rights organization that works alongside community partners to transform public institutions and shift investments to achieve racial equity. We do this work primarily through policy advocacy on 4 issues. Those issues are education, public funding, health, and democracy. Our democracy work is housed in a program area that we refer to as Political Voice, and that's the program area that Alejandra and I work in. Political Voice does work on primarily 4 issues. One is public participation in governance. Another is voting and election systems. A third is redistricting, and finally, the census. With respect to the census, we work on both the policy side and the field outreach side. On the policy side, we convene the Census Policy Advocacy Network, or CPAN, which is a coalition of statewide organizations working to educate policymakers and community leaders about the sound policies and government investments needed to ensure a fair and accurate count in 2020. On the field outreach side, we convene the Los Angeles Regional Census Table, which is a space for community-based organizations and other nonprofits to coordinate outreach efforts, share resources and knowledge, and collaborate with local governments in the region, particularly the county and city of Los Angeles. We are also conducting a series of webinars in counties across the state, and today's webinar is part of that series. And the purpose of the webinar is to ensure that community-based organizations and other nonprofits in Merced County are informed about the 2020 census and motivated to lead outreach efforts in the region. We hope that by the end of the webinar today, we all have a shared understanding of why the decennial census matters, some clarity on key questions about the 2020 census, data on your region's hard-to-count populations, and finally, a shared understanding of what your organization can do to ensure an accurate count in your region. To get there, you will hear from Alejandra and I, as well as from Jesus Martinez, who's with the Central Valley Immigrant Integration Collaborative, about why the census matters, why our state and your region are at high risk for an undercount, what's being done to mitigate that risk, and how your organization can plug into those efforts. Before we conclude at noon today, we will have space for Q&A, so you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. Before proceeding, a few housekeeping items. One is that we ask for everyone other than scheduled speakers, please remain muted for the duration of the webinar. For the Q&A session, please send your questions directly to the host, which is Political Voice. And finally, this webinar is being recorded for future viewing. All right, so with that, let's get started by addressing why the census matters. So the census matters for a variety of reasons. One is that it is constitutionally mandated. Another is that it's an opportunity for building community power. And one way that organizations can do this is by reaching out to community residents that they haven't reached out to and therefore build their base. Organizations can also establish new organizational relationships across regions and across issues through census outreach campaigns. They can also develop community leaders by having community residents take on leadership roles as part of census outreach campaigns. Ultimately, however, the census matters because of how census data are used, and the data are used in 3 important ways. One is to ensure protection of civil rights. So if you think about the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, all of these pieces of legislation rely on census or census-derived data for their enforcement. Another important role of the data is that the data are used to ensure equal and equitable political representation. So every 10 years, seats in the House of Representatives are reapportioned. So some states gain seats, some states lose seats, and that's based on population estimates from the census count. Those census counts are also used to redraw political districts from the federal to the local level. So you think about your congressional districts, your state legislative districts, your county supervisorial districts, your city council districts, school districts, water board districts, other special districts, all of those lines are redrawn every 10 years based on population estimates from the census count. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly for a lot of folks, census data are used to guide the allocation of over $600 billion annually in federal funds to states and local communities to support programs in health, education, housing, transportation, and more. The state of California receives over $115 billion annually through 55 programs that rely on census-derived data. $76 billion of that $115 billion comes from just the 16 largest census-guided federal programs. So there's a lot at stake. And in order for residents in Merced County to receive their fair share of federal funding and political representation in the decade after 2020, the Census Bureau must accurately count all of the county's residents. However, there are three factors that are converging that are going to make it difficult for the Bureau to do that. And those factors are your region's demographics, innovations by the Census Bureau, and shifts in the federal landscape. So this morning, I'll briefly run through each one of those, beginning with the last. So over the last several years, there have been shifts in the federal landscape that are really putting the state of California and Merced County at risk of an undercount. You can see those shifts on your screen. They include chronic underfunding of the Census Bureau. So the Census Bureau in fiscal year 2018, and it looks like 2019, are relatively in at least better shape than they were in previous years. There were several years where the Bureau was chronically underfunded, and because of that underfunding and also funding uncertainties, the Bureau had to scale back on planning and preparations, and also actually have to forego certain planning and preparation operations. Additionally, although a permanent director was sworn in for the Census Bureau last month, Stephen Dillingham, the Bureau was without permanent leadership for a year and a half, and therefore without a director that could advocate for what the Bureau needed in both Congress and in the White House. Beyond that, there have been some policy shifts that are putting us at risk, and those include shifts to federal immigration policy. So as I'm sure most of you know, the Trump administration, or President Trump, has issued executive orders which have led to an increase in immigration enforcement and broadened the scope of who is a priority for that enforcement. That's helped to generate fear in immigrant communities, and that fear can lead to depressed census participation rates. Similarly, President Trump has issued some executive orders banning travel for people from majority Muslim countries, and that is coinciding with the rise in Islamophobia in this country. And that is also helping to generate fear in communities. In this case, it's in Muslim communities. And again, this is something that could help to depress census participation rates. For California, both of these should be of deep concern. We're the state with the largest percentage of foreign-born residents at 27%. We're also the state with the second largest number of mosques. So we have a sizable immigrant population and a sizable Muslim population. Anything that adversely affects participation in either one of those populations is going to impact our population count overall. However, we're also being affected or impacted by another set of factors that are putting us at risk. And those factors have to do with how the 2020 census will be administered. So the upcoming decennial census will be unlike any in our country's history, and that has to do largely with how it's going to be administered. In an effort to comply with the 2010, a congressional mandate that came after the 2010 census, which mandates the Census Bureau conduct the 2020 census at a cost per household that does not exceed the cost per household for the 2010 census, the Census Bureau has been in the process of developing and implementing what it refers to as 4 innovations. You can see those 4 innovations there on your screen. In the interest of time, I'm just going to draw your attention to one, and that is the internet as primary mode of self-response. So I'm sure some, or not many or all of you have heard, this will be the first online census. And what that means is that the Census Bureau is going to be encouraging people to primarily respond online. There will be other options for residents to respond, but the primary mode of response is going to be online. So residents will still be able to respond via paper questionnaire, via telephone. However, the Bureau will be encouraging most folks to respond online. Beyond these shifts, another shift in administration, and it's also something many of you may have heard of, and that's the addition of a citizenship question to the 2020 Census Questionnaire. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross directed the Census Bureau last year to add a question about citizenship to the 2020 Census Questionnaire. You can see the question there on your screen. Both before and since Secretary Ross's decision, there's been opposition to adding such a question. What's important to note now is that there are at least half a dozen lawsuits against the addition of this question, and the first ruling in those lawsuits was issued last month by a district judge who ruled against the Trump administration and directed the Census Bureau to halt preparations to add that question. The Trump administration quickly appealed that decision. They appealed that decision to an appellate court. They also asked the Supreme Court to expedite review of the lower court's decision. And it was announced last week that the Supreme Court will review that lower court's decision. We expect a hearing in April. So that's where things stand on that. There's more that we could say. If there are additional questions about the citizenship question, we're happy to answer those during Q&A. I now want to move on to the third set of factors, putting, again, the state and Merced County at risk of an undercount. And that has to do with our demographics. And this is really the most important factor. The issue has to do with what is referred to, or popularly referred to, as hard to count, or HTC populations. An HTC population is a population that is less likely to participate in the census for whatever reason. On your screen there, you see the HTC populations that the state of California recognizes. So the state recognizes a minimum of 15 populations. If you actually count the number of populations on your screen there, you'll see there are 16. And the reason for that is that we separate Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. The state lumps those populations together. So California, our demographics put our state at such a risk because we have a high concentration of those hard to count populations. And that high concentration makes us the hardest to count state in the country. CPAN estimates that a minimum of 19.2 million Californians qualify as hard to count. And Merced County actually has a sizable portion of that number. And you can see we've broken down that the HTC estimate for Merced County there on your screen. So approximately 200,000 residents in Merced County qualify as hard to count. And you see that they're broken down by race and ethnicity. It's also broken down by those that live within our census tracts that have high and very high low response scores, and those living outside of those census tracts. So that's what LRS tract refers to as low response score. And a low response score, the low response score is the metric that the Census Bureau is using to help it identify hard to count census geographies for the 2020 census. And it uses that metric so that it understands what geographies are going to be difficult to enumerate, and therefore what geographies need more resources. So that's what that metric refers to. And so we've identified the residents living within those census tracts, those hard to count census tracts, but we also think it's important to identify the hard to count that live outside of those hard to count census tracts. And so what you see there in the third column is that population, again, broken down by race and ethnicity. And what we've done is identified those residents by discrete characteristics. So for Latinos, it's Latino non-citizens, it's non-Hispanic whites living below the poverty line, Asian Americans with limited English proficiency, Blacks and African Americans living below the poverty line. And then for Native Americans and Pacific Islanders, what you're seeing there is just the remainder of the county's population. Because both of those populations are relatively small and just generally hard to count, we didn't think it made sense to identify one or a few characteristics. And so what you see there is just the total populations, but broken down by those living within hard to count census tracts and those living outside of them. We know generally what explains lower likelihood of participation, and most of those reasons boil down to barriers. And we know what some of the common barriers to participation are. They include uncertainty about what the census is, how the data are used, uncertainty about who should be included. That's often how young children get missed. Parents don't know that they should include their young children, even their newborns. Fear or mistrust of government is a key barrier, and finally, limited English proficiency. So the challenge for folks in Merced County is to help a minimum of 200,000 residents in the county, which actually makes up about 75% of residents in the county, help them overcome these and other barriers to participate in the census. And to help give us a more detailed picture or a sense of where those folks live, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Alejandra.
Perfect. Thank you, John. So now we're going to be diving deeper into Merced's hard-to-count populations. And so we conducted an analysis of the data utilizing the Census Bureau Response Outreach Area Mapper, or ROAM, to look into those geographies, those census tracts that are scoring very high, well, high and very high in the low response score. So we were looking at those census tracts that were scoring 25% and above. And so here on your screen, you see the link to the ROAM website. So definitely, if someone has not checked it out, I encourage you to go into it and explore just what it looks like and the kind of information that you find there. So again, as John was mentioning, so we were looking at the LRS, the low response score. And again, this is measuring, the percentage of households that are predicted not to self-respond to the census. And so it's capturing the hard-to-count populations by geography. And the way that they calculate, they use a variety of variables such as age, race and ethnicity, English proficiency, poverty level, and so forth, to be able to calculate a score for each of the census tracts. And so when we went ahead and did this analysis, we looked at, again, the census tracts that scored 25% and above. And within the analysis, what we did was that we zoomed into the top 25. So the top 25 either on LRS, the top 25 on different demographics, and that information we're going to be showing a snapshot today over the webinar, just given the time. But I do want to let you all know that you will have full access to the whole data analysis that we carried out. And so after the webinar, we will be sharing the copies of the material as well. So do not, freak out if you don't have all the information at this moment, but you will have it. So first, I just wanted to give everybody a glimpse of, one, what the ROAM data set looks like in terms of the maps and how the census tracts are captured and color coded. So as you can see here, those areas, those census tracts that are very dark blue, those are the very high census tracts that are scoring 30% and above. And then following that color, the teal color, those are all that are scoring 25% and above. So this is just to give you a sense of just geographically how the distribution is of all these census tracts that are scoring high and very high in your county. Here's another image zooming into the city of Merced, and so we see here two of the census tracts that are very high on the LRS score. And then following, here's another glimpse of the county over there by Los Baños, Dos Palos. And so again, as John was mentioning, about 70% of the population in Merced is actually very high on the hard to count population. So here we have just a breakdown of the census tracts in terms of how many census tracts exist that are high and very high on the LRS by city. And so as you can see here, Merced, the city of Merced is by far has the most, 14 census tracts, followed by Atwater. We have a total of 37 census tracts that are either high or very high in the county. So at least you have a breakdown of these regions and really thinking about, where you're located geographically, the communities that you work in, just how some of these census tracts overlap in your community as well. Next are the population estimates within it's actually the high and the very high census tracts together. So again, as John was mentioning, right here we have over 194,000 residents based on the ROAM data. that are living in these census tracts. You can see here that over 52,000 are below poverty. Out of those, over 120,000 are Latino, followed by Asian Americans that are over 13,000 people. Black, African American, over 6,000. American Indian, Alaska Native, 687,000, not 1,000, but 687 folks, and Pacific Islanders. You see the numbers here, and then foreign born, over 52,000. So this is just to get a sense of the demographics, at least based on race, and then just, key variables such as poverty and foreign born. So next, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the sample of the data analysis that we did. And so here, we're only capturing the top 10. Again, the complete information will be top 25 for folks to have access to. And so as you can see here, that in the city of Merced, the Census Tract 1601 is number 1 in terms of the one that's scoring the highest on LRS. And this is the area that's it's like the south central area of the city of Merced, east of the Merced Regional Airport. So just to get a sense. Again, I will be having handouts for everybody where we will have the complete description, geographic description of each of these census tracts. The next set of top 10 are all based on racial and ethnic demographics. And so we did conduct census analysis of other variables, but given that a lot of the organizations, might be approaching the census outreach in terms of race and ethnicity, we wanted to at least give you a snapshot of where the census tracts have the highest number of each of these populations. Again, one of the reasons why we wanted to share this by race and ethnicity is that for each of these communities, there's going to be there's going to need to be a tailored approach and also messaging for each of these communities. So folks that are, primarily working with the Latino community, the area of Planada in tract 1901 is actually the area that has the highest percentage of Latinos in their community. Next up is the top 10 for Black African American community. And so here we have the Grove, which is tract 5.03. And this area, it's northeast of Winton, surrounding Castle Airport. And so this one has the highest population of Black African American. Next up, for Asian Americans, it's actually in Livingston in tract 304. And so this is like the central area of Livingston, where you have 22% of its population there is Asian American. Next up, it is American Indian, Alaska Native. And so here we see that tract 2.01, which is in Delhi. It covers like the east side of Delhi, but also the entire area of Balico. And that's 3% of its population. Lastly, top 7. We didn't get a top 10 because there weren't enough census tracts actually that contain any population of Pacific Islanders. So it's only the top 7 that I'm able to show here. And so it's actually in the city of Atwater. That's number 1 for 5.05. And that's south of Cressy, around Winton Cemetery. And it extends all the way down to the 140 highway. So that whole stretch of area has the highest concentration at 2.6%. So the next set of slides, I wanted to uplift 3 census tracts that are going to be very key, and just to get a real understanding in terms of the complexity and the diversity that exists within each of these census tracts, and really for folks to think about as you're developing your strategies and plans to do census outreach, really thinking about which are the census tracts that you would want to prioritize given its demographics. So here in this area, it's tract 1601 in the city of Merced. So it's highlighted in neon blue. The border here, again, is a south central area east of the Merced Regional Airport. And so this area here, as you can see, it's number 1 on multiple indicators or multiple demographics. So it's number 1 on LRS. It also has it's number 1 on having the lowest household income. Also having the number 1 in below poverty percentage-wise and foreign-born percentage-wise. This is also the tract that's number 1 in having households percentage-wise that no one in the household 14 age years and above that speak English very well, and it's the #1 for renter occupied. So you can also see the rest of the breakdown of the other areas that is ranking in terms of like children or Latino population, Black, African American as well. So again, this is just to elevate, like the concentration and the diversity that exists within a census tract. The next one that I wanted to share is tract 1602, and that's also in the city of Merced. And so it's a little bit hard to see, but it's this neon blue that's stretching around it, and that's east of the Merced Municipal Airport. And it goes up until the 99, I think, freeway right there. And so here, this area, as you can see, it's #2 for Black African American in terms of raw numbers, and it's also #2 for Asian American population in terms of percentage. Also interesting is that it's #3 for Asian American raw, but it's also #3 for foreign-born birth percentage-wise and raw numbers. So again, just the number of demographics that this census tract also contains is key. Lastly, it's in Planada, tract 1901. And so this whole stretch of Planada is #1 for Latino population percentage-wise, and it's #2 for Pacific Islander, both percentage-wise and raw numbers. And so again, it's just incredible the number of demographics that this census tract alone has, and it's within the top 25 for these various demographics as well. So John and I just shared a lot of the challenges and gave you a closer look in terms of the data and of the hard-to-count population. And so this is a very daunting task, especially given just percentage-wise, like how many folks in the county are hard-to-count populations. And so, but we don't want you to freak out. We want you to also, we want to pass it over to Jesus to talk about, what's been happening at the state and what's been happening primarily locally to ensure that your communities are going to be counted in the census. So pass it over to you, Jesus. Jesus, you may want to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Alejandra. If we can go to my presentation, please. Thank you very much for the invitation, John and Alejandra, to speak with Merced colleagues. My name is Jesus Martinez. I'm the Executive Director of the Central Valley Immigrant Integration Collaborative. Next slide, please. Civic, the organization that I represent, is fairly new. We were created in 2014, primarily as an attempt to try to better coordinate efforts in the Central Valley to assist immigrant families. So we operate primarily through collaboration with a whole bunch of different organizations, legal service providers and non-legal service providers. We organize events, training opportunities for partners, among other things, and also become involved in a series of issues, including nowadays, obviously, the census effort. But our work on immigration has extended from Kern County all the way to San Joaquin County, although most of our partner organizations are based in Fresno. Next slide, please. And what we have learned in these few years that Civic has been in existence, working here in the Central Valley, I want to share a couple of major points that are very much related to the census efforts. Next, please. The major one, of course, is that immigrants, as the presentation by John and Alejandra pointed out, primarily the immigrants that we have been serving through our work offering DACA, naturalization, and other services, those immigrants tend to constitute hard-to-count communities. When we started doing the work, we developed a strategic plan which concluded that there were some 900,000 immigrants living in those counties that I mentioned, from Kern to San Joaquin. Plus, they also had some 500,000 children with at least one immigrant parent. So it's a huge population, and the majority of those are living in communities, in neighborhoods that are considered hard to count. And for the reasons that John also indicated earlier in his presentation, all the anti-immigrant rhetoric, plus the characteristics of the current 2020 census that is being proposed, make immigrants a hard-to-count community. Next slide, please. But we also learned something very significant that is what has made our work in the region possible, that it is feasible, effective, and efficient to coordinate events and to collaborate at the local and at the regional level Without the collaboration of many nonprofit and community-based organizations, public sector agencies, among others, we would not have been able to have many of the events that we have had up until now. Since 2014 to this date, I think we easily have had over 300 legal services workshops, plus hundreds and hundreds of informational events due to the collaboration and networking with so many partners. Next slide, please. So we know that immigrants are hard to count. We know that also regional collaboration and coordination are possible. So we also, since a little bit over a year ago, we have begun to work on the census, and we developed a census-related strategy that focuses on 5 major points. One of those is that we have become involved in supporting the creation of local level coalitions that have eventually become complete count committees. We began this work trying to organize the very first meetings in Fresno in the month of May and June, and then expanded to other counties, including Kern, Tulare, Merced, obviously, San Joaquin, and Stanislaus. These efforts to organize these meetings took place at a time when there was very little or no support being provided to these community-based organizations on the part of foundations, or much less the state or federal government. So this was being done with the involvement of agencies that were not receiving support at that moment. A second important element of our work has been to help develop the organizational capacity. So we've been offering to all these different local level groups different training opportunities. We've been helping them to develop capacity to apply for state funding, particularly for CBOs. We've also developed for each of them, to the extent that they need, a listserv, and we've also connected them to states, in some cases to state, and all of them to federal census agencies. So all of them, for example, have had presentations by Census Bureau representatives, and the Census Bureau representative has been involved in helping them become formalized as complete count committees. A third important point that we tried to address from the very beginning in these efforts, as a result of the meetings that we're having in different parts of the San Joaquin Valley, is that we were beginning to see a pattern emerging in all these meetings, is that almost every one of these meetings tended to highlight the very same types of concerns and issues that were being raised. So we have argued that there's a certain degree of similarity in the challenges that are being faced by the Central Valley communities. Among those challenges, obviously, that the CBOs work with very hard count communities, but also a series of other characteristics, like, for example, very little resources in the way of resources, financial and otherwise, very little engagement by local level governments, and including city and county. And those are some of the significant challenges. So part of what we have been proposing from the beginning is to begin to think also in regional terms, and to begin to share materials, ideas that we develop along this process, so that not every single group has to reinvent the wheel. Fourth important element of the work that we've been doing has become involved in different census-related research projects. So in December of 2017, January of 2018, we became involved in a research project that included Fresno, San Francisco, San Jose, to take a look at housing units in certain neighborhoods of Fresno that were not included in the census master address file. And if a housing unit is not included, it means that housing unit is not going to be receiving a notification from the Census Bureau to participate in the 2020 census. So we documented the existence of many such household units in Fresno. Then a second study was conducted in Stockton that also found the same type of pattern in some neighborhoods. And more recently, and still taking place, we're involved in a much broader census research project with San Joaquin Valley Health Fund and a bunch of different nonprofit organizations and community-based organizations to document also how immigrant communities in the Central Valley are responding to the census, and in particular to the proposed Citizenship Question. That project has already released some of the studies. A total of 6 reports will be issued. 2 of them are already out by the San Joaquin Valley Health Fund. And finally, another important point of the work that we have been doing is to try to become involved in census-related advocacy efforts at the local, state, and also at the federal level. At the local level, obviously, to become involved in trying to persuade local level governments to pay attention to the census, to approve a resolution in order to opt in to state funding at the state level, to try to bring to the attention of the state officials the issues that we are seeing in the Central Valley, and also to propose an increase in funding that the state of California can issue to CBOs and others for participation in the 2020 census. And at the federal level, to become involved also, among other things, in efforts to do away with the proposed citizenship question, a very important issue that is affecting immigrants, but as we have found in the Central Valley research, not only immigrants, also the children who are US born, and even some other social contacts who themselves may not be immigrants. So the citizenship question is actually impacting a much broader sector of the overall population than just immigrants. Next slide, please. So that is the beginning of the work that we have carried out from about May up until now. And what we perceive at the moment is that there are still a lot of things that need to be done. John and Alejandra have pointed out some very important elements of the strategy that needs to be developed. But among the things that we think are still greatly needed, one is far more extensive and in-depth involvement by many different types of organizations and institutions. Many more CBOs need to become engaged in this process. We need to have local level governments and authorities become better informed about the census and get them involved in a very active manner. We need to involve many different types of private sector entities, from chambers of commerce to individual businesses. So that's something that needs to be done, I think, extensively throughout the entire Central Valley. Another important area of work, actually, that we may not always be paying attention to is that both at the state, but particularly at the federal level, there are a lot of census-related employment opportunities that are coming up, and we need to have people who are well qualified to take those positions apply for them. If we don't have well qualified people applying for those positions, from high-level administrative positions to census canvassers once the 2020 census comes about, then the Central Valley is not going to be doing a good job of representing the population that we have here in the region. So that's a really, actually very important element of the work that we need to carry out from now on. And the third one, going back to the other slide, is that we need to try to promote better coordination of the regional work that is being done right now, that is just starting at this moment. So that needs to take place in a more adequate manner so that we're not, once again, reinventing the wheel. We're not duplicating efforts, particularly when the resources are so limited. And at this moment, when there really is still no major funding coming into the regions from the state or federal, much less the federal level. Next slide, please. And so we believe that the process here in the Central Valley is really just getting started to do a very good job of ensuring an accurate, complete count of the Central Valley population. But compared to other parts of the state of California, particularly LA, and also some communities in the Bay Area, they began not only to work on the census over a year ago, but also to invest in local level funds in these efforts, something that has not taken place in the Central Valley. Next slide, please. So the bottom line for us is that there's still a heck of a lot of work that needs to be done, and we need more engagement from everyone. Next slide, please. And here we have some additional resources in addition to those that have been listed by John and Alejandra. The official State of California Census website, census.ca.gov, is having a lot of information being uploaded to that website. It would be a great starting point for anyone interested in pursuing additional information. The Census.gov, the federal level, is obviously very useful and has also lots of materials that can be consulted. One of our websites, civic.org, we've been uploading a lot of information, many documents that can be utilized by CBOs and local level governments, including, for example, some of the reports of the research project that I mentioned. And there's also the website of the San Joaquin Valley Health Fund that you can access. Next slide, please. And our contact information. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesus. So I wanted to open it up for folks to have questions for any of us in terms of the census as it relates to even just the work that folks are doing already on the ground. If there are key issues that folks are, still grappling around, we definitely want you to take opportunity of the space to ask those questions. We still haven't gotten any questions shot at us via chat, but please feel free to chat questions right now, or if you feel more comfortable speaking, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, go right ahead. But as folks are kind of thinking about one that I wanted to uplift and pose it to John and also Jesus, in terms of just a citizenship question, I think that a lot of the concerns has come up about, if it does get implemented, what are the options that people have in terms of, what to do in that situation. And so, John, if you want to take it
up. So the main thing that organizations can do if the question is on there is to inform residents about what their options are. Organizations should not discourage community residents from filling out the survey, either partially or completely. Doing so puts your organization at risk of losing its 501c3 status. So it is against the law to do that, but it is not against the law to inform residents about what their options are. So that includes that residents can skip questions and still be counted. So informing them of what their options are is certainly one thing that organizations can do. And at least one thing they shouldn't do is proactively discourage participation. And I think we will share Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus drafted a memo on this question and actually lays out in more detail than I just provided what the options are. And we will be sharing that memo with you all, as well as some one-pagers that they created.
Perfect. Thank you, John. So the next question that we have here is, are there any, Jesus, this could be a question that you can answer. Are there any LGBTQ focus groups involved in Merced County Complete Count Committee?
I don't have the list with me right now. It's still a small committee. There's room for a heck of a lot of participation. We do have organizations involved in the Fresno and Modesto and San Joaquin County committees. In the Merced County, the key contact for this, because that's where we have been where the meetings have taken place, the key contact is Vicky Solis from the Merced County Office of Education. She heads the Head Start program. So anyone is interested can send me an email message at the email that is listed there, and I'll be happy to share Vicky's email with you. I don't have it with me at the moment, but I can certainly do that. And the next meeting of the Merced County is going to be taking place next month in March.
Cool, thank you. So a question is, and this can be either John or Jesus, you mentioned that the census would primarily be filled out online. How would this work for rural census tracts, considering that they might have limited access to the internet?
I can take a stab at this at the moment. That is a major problem that we have identified in the Central Valley. It has been an issue that has been raised everywhere, in every single county. And the census has different responses for this, and we can also develop some responses of our own. One is that when not only is there a problem with access to the web, to the internet on the part of some communities, but also the Central Valley, one of the things that it also has are neighborhoods that receive mail, or even cities that receive mail, not in their homes, but via PO boxes. So that's another related challenge. But with respect to the internet, what the census and local level organizations have attempted to do in developing a strategy is to try to identify local level institutions, whether it's schools, libraries, whatever else, and community centers, that might be able to present some options for local level families who do not have access to the internet. But a related challenge to that is that even, for example, if there is a family that has access to internet via smartphone, that maybe the adults in the family do not necessarily have the literacy level to understand how to fill out a form online. So it's a related challenge that also needs to be addressed. So part of the outreach that needs to be carried out in each of these local level communities is what type of infrastructure can be created to assist people who do not have access to the internet, what types, for example, of kiosks and other types of services can be created. But also in the case of people who do not themselves have the literacy level to be able to fill out a form online, what can be done in that purpose? So some of the questions that we have had for the Census Bureau is to what extent can a community-based organization assist a person in filling out a form, a person who is not able to do that. And we're still trying to get clarity on that. We get different responses depending on who you ask, but it is possible for organizations, public sector agencies like libraries, schools, and others, as well as community-based organizations to assist people to have access to the internet.
The only thing I'll add is just as a reminder, so as mentioned earlier, residents will be able to respond via paper questionnaire and they'll be able to respond telephonically. They will, some communities are going to receive the paper questionnaire at the same time where they receive the packet, encouraging them to respond online. Other communities won't. Actually, most communities will not also receive the paper questionnaire. So if a community resident prefers to respond via the paper questionnaire, they will have to call and request that. And then if they would like to respond telephonically, then there will be contact information provided for them to do that. So it is important to keep that in mind, that in an online response is not the only type of response for a community resident. And so organizations should be part of the messaging, is that there are multiple ways that community residents can respond.
Perfect. So the next question is the Merced County LULAC chapter involved? They're mostly focused in Los Baños and Danela area, which is a hard to count area. Jesus, you may want to answer that question.
No, to my knowledge, they're not involved yet. Cia is on.
Jesus, I don't know if you muted yourself or got cut off.
No, I mentioned that as far as I know, LULAC is not involved yet in the Merced County committee. And again, the committee is just getting started, so there's a lot of room to engage additional organizations. And the meetings have taken place in the city of Merced. So for example, to invite and get involved with organizations that are based in Los Baños or another location, local meetings have to take place in those locations as well to involve the local level groups. We know that it's challenging to be traveling long distances to go to meetings because the meetings may not take place in a time that is feasible for an individual. So we need to reach out to many different locations other than just the cities where the meetings have taken place so far. I think Cia is on the line as well as in the group. If you'd like to add anything else, Cia.
And see if you like to jump on, just unmute yourself. But if not, okay, we'll go on to the next question. See if you want to bring us back to that. You know, you're more than welcome to. So a question is, if a CBO does indicate that residents can skip questions and still be counted, will this in turn be looked as encouraging them to not answer a question?
Oh, this is Jesus. We've raised, and John, if you also want to pitch in, we've asked the question to the census representatives who have gone to the California Complete Count Committee meetings in Sacramento, and they have indicated that it is possible to skip some question or questions. What we also get in terms of a response is that we still don't have a clarity on how many questions you can skip. But again, to go back to the presentation by John, on the citizenship question, it isn't just a matter of including or responding or not to the question. The whole 2020 census process has resulted in much greater concern and wariness, fear on the part of immigrants and other social groups. So it isn't just the citizenship question that is difficult to address on the part of immigrants and other hard-to-count groups, but it's a number of other problems that have become associated with the 2020 census. And regarding the citizenship question, there's still a possibility, and we would encourage everyone to become involved in trying to do away with the question. It is not set in stone. We can still get rid of it. So that would at least eliminate an important barrier.
Yeah, so I'll just add that in relation to what I had mentioned earlier, this should be, so if you think about it, organizations should think about this as know your rights, and it shouldn't just be telling community residents you can skip questions and still be counted. That should be, that's messaging that should be included among other important things that residents need to understand or know or should know in relationship to the census. And whether the federal government will look at that as encouraging them to not answer, we have no indication that would be perceived as encouraging them. So we have no indication that would be seen as encouraging them to not answer the question by informing residents of what they can do in terms of responding to the census questionnaire. And it's not, residents should fill out the questionnaire to the best of their ability. If there are concerns that they won't be counted, they should be assured that they will be counted. If they fill it out to the best of their ability, they will still be counted. If they fill it out partially or not at all, that does increase the likelihood that they may get a call from the Census Bureau, or an enumerator may come to their door during the non-response follow-up operation, which occurs from roughly early April all the way through July. So when folks talk about, people getting knocks on their doors, that's what they're talking about. And the reason that happens is because the Bureau is trying to follow up on people who either didn't fill out their form at all or filled it out partially. And so they're trying to complete that census questionnaire by sending enumerators out or calling homes.
Cool. So we have space for like 5 more minutes. Well, yeah, 4 more minutes. If folks have additional questions that you want to send in. I have one other question here. Who is leading the coordination of communication efforts in the Central Valley? There's an interest for an opportunity to connect with those folks. So Jesus, if you'd like to take that question.
The communication efforts?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, no, each complete count committee that has been established is going to be creating subcommittees or task forces focused on different issues. And obviously one of those important ones is going to have to be communication strategy. So that all of the complete count committees have been created recently in January or early February. So that is still in the process. If someone is interested in becoming involved in those efforts, as I mentioned, one of the things that we did was create listservs for each of these different groups, so we can share the information of anyone who might be interested. And by the way, one of the things that I also shared with the different listservs is the possibility of Civic offering a communication strategy training that will be multi-part later on, probably beginning in the month of April. So we'll be happy to share that also with the people who are in this webinar. So there is no one single person that is in charge of communication, but each committee will have to create its own task force or subcommittee dealing with communications.
Mm-hmm. And I guess related to this question from the person who's asking, I think might be in terms of like, for folks that are covering the story or journalists, if there's a point person or, who would be best to be connected to them if there's an interest for covering the story on those efforts.
Yeah, sometimes that depends on what this individual reporter may want to emphasize in the story. In some cases, they want to have a connection with people who are working in the area of health to see how that's going to be impacting. So they want to have contact with organizations. There's the Complete Count Committee who work with their health or maybe education, whatever the case may end up being. But we can put them in contact with the chairs of those committees and also with the listserv as a whole, and then have someone respond if they have a specific question or desire to communicate with specific type of participant in that committee. What we're trying to do on the part of Civic is to have the local leadership take over the contact, because that's part of the organizational development process, and the Complete Count committees are now established, although each of them is meeting on a different timetable. But all of this is still, as I mentioned before, in the early stages, but I think moving ahead with, in the case of Merced, a very enthusiastic, very good group of people.
Thank you, Jesus. Yes, wanted to see if there were any other questions that folks wanted to pose for any of the speakers. Cool. And so as mentioned before, so we will be sharing in a couple of weeks, we will be emailing you the link with the information of where you can find on our webpage in Advancement Project, the link to the recording of today's webinar, as well as all of the data analysis and materials for your region will be accessible to everybody. So I will be sharing that soon via email to folks that were on this webinar today, and definitely feel free to share that information with other folks as well. I'm going to see if anybody else had a question. All right. Well, I want to thank Jesus Martinez for being here and sharing all this important information that's happening in Merced County, and thanks to everybody who joined today's webinar. I definitely encourage folks that if you haven't been involved, get in touch with Jesus and other folks and be a part of ensuring that your region is counted, and then also just share this information with other folks. So with that, I want to wish everybody great day, and feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions later on. Thank you.